Hello, everybody. This is Jeffries Brigginshaw at TPN. Good afternoon and welcome to this series of TPN Talks. I'm delighted to be joined today by Amelie Coulet, who's Senior Manager, Government and Regulatory Affairs at IBM Europe. Amelie, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to asking you 3 or 4 questions, if I may, maybe one more if we have time. And I'm going to start, if I may, around the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. We know that in this year of elections, for the first time since 2004, as we know, we'll both have a European parliamentary election and a US presidential election. We've got a TTC coming up, the fifth ministerial, as they call it, in little less than a week's time. Advanced briefings suggest that we can look forward to discussions around sustainable trade and artificial intelligence as well as a general stock taking on progress in the working groups. In a general sense, how do you read the current state of transatlantic economic relations, and how do you rate prospects for the TTC this year in 2024?
Well, Jeffries, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be with you today. It's always a pleasure to take part in TPN's very rich transatlantic conversations. Well, listen, it's quite interesting to see how the EU-US economic relationship has evolved over the past decade or so. You and I, but many folks who've been involved in the transatlantic community, we've known many years of EU-US trade disputes, largely focused on agricultural exports, but we live in a different world now, a more volatile, a more complex world. And so we sort of see those disputes shifting to more existential issue, if I can use that term, to deal with climate change, conflicts, fast technological shifts. So really issues around supply chain security, critical minerals, clean tech subsidies, carbon border tax, China, etc. So from an economic perspective, the way that I see this relationship obviously remains certainly challenging, even when we've seen the political relationship be rather successful, notably recently, if we take the alignment on Ukraine, for example. So you mentioned the TTC. This was obviously launched with big expectations to strengthen that economic relationship. But it's fair to say that despite some successes, its progress has actually largely been hindered by those recent disputes, but also probably by lacking a clear, maybe realistic focus, maybe trying to address too many issues at once. So with the elections coming up in 2024, this is obviously a turning point for the TTC. We've heard the pessimistic scenario that it might not be a TTC in 2025. Allow me to take a more optimistic scenario here and argue that I think no matter the outcome of the EU and the US election, the TTC has allowed both sides to build a sort of dialogue infrastructure that I think, in my opinion, will continue to be critical going forward, specifically at the economic and the technical level. So IBM has been a strong supporter of the TTC. We still hope to see this framework survive this rocky election year. We hope it can be reformed, refocus on aligning approaches, particularly on the most pressing tech issues, whether it's AI or quantum. And so in this regard, I think transatlantic companies, but also forums like TPN can play a really important role in helping the TTC evolve and be successful in the future.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for your optimism on TTC. And I'm going to ask you a question about artificial intelligence, and I hope that you can have and share the same optimism. We've seen, a huge global focus on the opportunities and the risks that AI will bring for our economies and societies. We've just seen that there's a political agreement that's been reached in Europe for the EU AI Act, and I think we can expect that it should get passed in the spring. During the autumn, there's progress that's been made across a whole series of geographies, Europe, the US, globally, to define principles and rules that hopefully can provide a framework to help balance costs and benefits. I mean, looking back over the autumn and taking us right up to date in the AI field, were your highlights, and what do you think we can look forward to in 2024?
Yes, I mean, you rightfully say it. That I would say the tech policy highlight this fall was surely the provisional political agreement on the AI Act. But we could also mention President Biden executive order, the UK AI Safety Summit, the G7 AI principles. So those were all important policy moments, and they were all more or less happening at the same time. But I think we're just seeing the beginning of AI regulation across the globe. We're really at an inflection point right now. Whether it's government, businesses, society, everyone is more broadly aware of what AI is, of what are the massive opportunities it can bring, what are the potential for risk and misuse as well. So we have a collective challenge here, which is to make sure that AI regulation can maximize those benefits, minimize those risks, but also addressing the repercussion of innovations like AI, which will be just as important as the innovation or the technology itself. So what does it mean for governments? It means obviously making sure that policies are targeted, that they look at different use cases, that they base them on actual risk, that they look at different business model. What does it mean for consumer applications or business applications? And then I think for businesses, this means accountability from those who create and deploy AI. So I think this year, the AI policy conversation will most likely continue to focus on those issues that are related to trust and governance. In terms of what we can look at, for example, whether the EU will continue its work on the AI liability directive. In the US, whether we might see any follow-up to Biden's executive order, whether it's further legislation on algorithmic accountability, or perhaps some state legislation. We'll see new AI safety summit as well. After the UK, we know that France and South Korea should host the next one. The Italian G7 presidency too also mentioned that AI will be a key topic, the outcome of the Council of Europe Convention. And I talked about the TTC earlier. This is also a key deliverable of the TTC. So this is the context which has led companies like ours not only look at AI from a technical or business point of view, but really focusing on governance as well. That's why we've actually recently launched a toolkit called Wax and X Governance, which aims to provide organization with everything they need to manage AI risk, to embrace that transparency, and really help them anticipate compliance with all those AI-focused regulations.
Thank you. And you're so right that as well as the technology, I think it behoves all of us to be really deeply invested in the kind of the governance arrangements, because the trust is not going to happen without that. And actually, when we come on to look at the area of data, and I've got a question here as well, that was so fundamental, the question of trust in the path that we've seen over the last decade or so as data privacy rules have developed. And there's a series of developments which could be seen to be puzzling, and potentially have been sending confusing messages about the state of play on global and transatlantic data flows. Now, I just want to ask you, in that area, we saw the good news of an EU-US adequacy agreement last summer. Of course, there's always the potential for a Schrems 3 and lawsuits around that, but the good news was that an agreement was reached. We've seen progress on EU-Japan data relations, and even on China-EU data relations, with some flexibility built in or offered on the Chinese side at the recent summit. But in October, on the US side, we saw the US trade representative quite suddenly, and just to many people's surprise, withdraw US support for US digital trade policy negotiating objectives, as they were up until that moment, which has, I think, undermined the direction, if you want, of the policy discussion around international data flow and regulation, up to and including the WTO. How do you read the situation? What do you make of it? Do you think it was an aberration, or how do you read, particularly the US side of that equation, and more broadly where it leaves us?
Yeah, I mean, you put it in the right way. Confusing message would be a very good summary of the current situation, or puzzling, if you will. I mean, listen, we're seeing a shift right now in terms of digital trade and data flows. You mentioned the US, this is the biggest shift. First, because it comes from the largest digital economy in the world, pulling out of important data flow discussion in the WTO e-commerce negotiation. And the issue is that the US has been the sort of standard bearer for rules enabling cross-border data flows. If we just take the USMCA example, which was an important deal from a digital trade perspective. And these rules have never prevented the US government's ability to regulate or address any policy concerns, whether it's privacy or competition, unlike what we can hear from the ones who've been behind that recent move in the WTO. And then on the other side, you see the EU, which has long resisted pushing for more ambitious digital trade provisions, using the very same, I would say, regulatory space reason that we've heard from the US side. We're now showing more flexibility, as we've seen in the the EU-Japan data flow deal that you just mentioned, and which we hope will become a new basis for EU digital trade provision in the future. So, I mean, the way that I read those issues is that they're becoming too politicized and really moving away from addressing the legitimate concerns around security or privacy. It's pretty simple. Enabling the free flow of data is not about favoring big tech, but data flows today are the lifeblood of all businesses, whether it's automotive, industrial machinery, agriculture, pharmaceutical, or even services like audiovisual, financial services, etc. And so restricting data flows will mostly affect those businesses and also affect small businesses. So how do we expect those companies to accelerate their digital transformation if they, for example, have to build or lease a local data center in foreign markets to be able to comply with data localization requirements? So it's really absolutely critical from our perspective that the EU and the US go back to forge a common approach on this. If they do not, they both risk further encouraging countries that do not necessarily share similar values or share similar concerns around security or privacy or even free trade to assert greater control over people's data or pushing for more protectionist policy. So, I mean, you mentioned Schrems and other, I think we really need to go back to transatlantic alignment on this important issue here.
Yeah, and I think you offer good advice and also acknowledge that there's a political reality at play at any given time. And I think when we look at the broader kind of global tech environment and the risks of fragmentation that there may be there, there is a question as to whether the sum total of all that does crowd out innovation. And I'd like to ask you about that because as a corporation, as an enterprise, IBM, of course, has been at the front end and the cutting edge of innovation for a century or more. So who better than to ask? I mean, do you see a likelihood that the global digital economy will fragment through the emergence of national digital rules, could be anywhere but China and Russia included, that crowd out innovation? And is there a transatlantic middle way? Is there middle ground where Europe, for example, can dial down neo-protectionist tendencies for, let's say, sovereign tech to allow us all to deliver to broader ambitions that make space for innovation, whether it's US or wherever it comes from? And if so, what could be the basis for that? And what should be the basis and the next steps for transatlantic digital policy dialogue? What are the priorities for you?
Yeah, I mean, this really goes back to your previous question and the lack of EU-US alignment on digital trade that I was just talking about. I mean, we clearly see a risk of increased fragmentation. I'm just going to take one practical example. In about a month's time, we'll have the next WTO ministerial conference, MC13. And particularly, we'll know whether the e-commerce moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmission will be renewed or not. And in the likelihood that it's not renewed, we might just see some countries impose duties on digital services while others won't. this will definitely lead some companies to divert digital investment from one region to another, which will increase innovation gaps, surely. So there is clearly a real risk there. The reality is that neither the EU or the US have really been able yet to come up with a trade model that can address the new issues that the world has to face or the new power dynamics that are at play. So I don't know if we can call the transatlantic way the middle way, but from our perspective, we're really a firm believer in a common transatlantic approach. And by that, I don't mean to say that the EU and the US should do the exact same thing or have the same policy, but they're the ones who have the firepower and the economic influence to push digital trade towards an ambitious trajectory. Both share the same goals of building technological capabilities, resilience. Both have similar values. So for us, this common approach is a pretty simple one. It should be really about those values first. That means if a US company invests in Europe, create jobs in Europe, demonstrate trust and accountability with regards to EU regulation, that company should not be discriminated because its HQ is not in the EU, and vice versa for EU company in the US. So for us, any transatlantic digital policy dialogue should be really based on this principle. So that we can then look at core issues, identify opportunities, challenges. How can we build resilience and capabilities? How can we encourage innovation? And then what are the policy frameworks that are needed for that? But we shouldn't start from the premise that only an EU company in the EU or only a US company in the US can deliver on the objectives I just mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to push you a little bit further on that, into the kind of harder edges of geopolitical conflict and as they apply to tech. And we saw with actually the ongoing Dutch semiconductor export story with ASML and Dutch export licensing restrictions that there's, absolutely a heightened awareness in Europe, just like in Europe, in the US, as to the risks of technology leakage, the implications of technology leadership in the global order. And we know yesterday, in fact, the Commission released its latest set of proposals that address economic security. And one way or another, everybody's trying to balance trade, security, international relations, particularly with China, and have used words like decoupling, de-risking, etc. I mean, how do you see that set of challenges from a corporate point of view? Naturally, corporations want to do business where they can, subject to keeping up with governance standards and their own value systems. But you can't be blind to geopolitical sensitivities. And how do you navigate those? It must be difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, listen, global companies like IBM obviously require sourcing from a complex, interconnected global supply chain. And so the current geopolitical situation certainly comes with challenges for us, but for everyone as well, and particularly in the area of critical technologies. You mentioned the EU's publication yesterday of the Economic Security Package. This includes many important initiatives, for example, on dual use, export control coordination, research security, inbound, outbound investment. So at IBM, we certainly support those efforts, whether it's in the EU, also in the US, to reinforce economic security and implement what we call precision export controls, which are targeted and effective export controls that really strengthen national security while ensuring continued global competitiveness. The way we decide that we just make sure to adhere to the highest ethical standards, to fully comply with, and in many cases even exceeds the requirements of US law, including US export controls, but also in the laws of each country we operate. So from our perspective, this is yet another area where we believe in a transatlantic precision approach to address these challenges, really focusing on critical technologies and, most importantly, last but not least, making sure this is all done in coordination and in partnership with global allies as well.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that. And we're coming towards the close, but I do have one more question, and it kind of goes back to where we started, which is that we're in a year of elections. And at TPN, we've been arguing the need to make sure that we can strengthen the resilience of transatlantic relations through political cycles and changing priorities. So we may not live through another 4 years of the type of orientation of the Biden administration, for example. And in the TPN world, that's meant that we've tried to draw some themes together around a compass project designed, really to see what we could all do to fireproof the transatlantic relationship with, 3 elements for us. One has been about doubling down on the focused use of the TTC, and you talked about that. Bringing the stakeholder voice and capability of legislators, but also business more into the mix, and also adding potentially some institutional updating of the relationship, maybe via a declaration or similar instrument. I mean, how do you see these ambitions, our TPN ambitions, but you don't have to stick to that. Well, those ambitions perhaps to build resilience and fireproof the transatlantic relationship. Do you see any merit in some of those or all of those elements that we're really focused on at TPN?
Yeah, if I can use a well-known historical transatlantic image to illustrate the transatlantic relationship this year, it will be a sort of sailing boat embarking on a dangerous journey across the Atlantic between Plymouth and the coast of New England, and which is probably going to hit a storm, so that boat better have some solid foundations in order to arrive at destination. So with this in mind, I think the work done by TPN and the Compass project, I think will be very important to establish those solid foundation and be able to maintain the dialogue going forward. So how do we fireproof this relationship? I mean, I'm thinking of two main suggestions in this regard. First, I think in the short term, and we talked about that earlier today. I mean, I think we really ought to focus on or refocus the transatlantic relationship on its economic and its trade benefits. This is really the major strength of that relationship. Sure, it's also one of the most challenging, particularly from a competitiveness point of view. But I think with the current global context, this is critical right now that we first find solution to resolve the current trade friction and particularly avoid creating new ones. So I would say in the short term, that would be the first focus. And then maybe second and final suggestion, I would also argue that in today's world, perhaps the transatlantic relationship, at least from a bilateral perspective, may not be sufficient in itself. I think it needs to be nurtured with a more global perspective in mind, integrate more like-minded partners, in the obvious one, UK, Singapore, Japan, Australia, Canada, etc. But also perhaps India or Brazil. I mean, the bilateral world order that we've known so far, largely built on EU-US foundations, if I may say, has really largely evolved towards a more multipolar order, where we see a lot of global actors that do not necessarily share our political or trade values really leverage their increased influence. So hence the need, I think, for us to really grow that transatlantic team and reinforce our political and economic links with those partners and allies across the globe. So yeah, I'd say those two things. Short term, really fixing the trade disputes, avoiding creating new one, and then perhaps globalizing the transatlantic relationship.
Again, Amelie, that sounds like very good advice, and I think we should be making sure to keep both of your points in mind as we go through 2024. But with that, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us, for sharing your thoughts on behalf of IBM. And we welcome them and we're grateful for them. And we look forward to continuing to work with you this year. But thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for TPN Talks. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeffrey, for having me, and thanks, TPN, for your great work, as always.